Kennst du diesen Film mit dem jungen Kerl, der mit seinem Auto in die Vergangenheit reisen kann? Ich weiß, das klingt jetzt verrückt, aber das ist aus dem Film. Das gibt es wirklich.
Time travel films and TV are the best. Well, that's what I think, and therefore it must be true. It is the internet after all. Throughout the years, there have been a lot of fantastic works centered around time travel. I've even heard people saying that there exists some not so fantastic offerings to the genre, although I'm not convinced by this point. No matter your opinion on time travel films, are you even human if when you hear the words time travel, you don't immediately think of Marty McFly, Dr. Emmett Brown, Biff Tannen, and George McFly? I sure do. In fact, just to give you context, there was a 3 to 4 month period in my youth when my brother and myself would get home from school and watch at least one of the classic trilogy on VHS every day. It never got old. Each film was as good as the last. We just loved getting into that DeLorean and flying off through time with Doc and Marty. And sure, the films weren't perfect, but that didn't matter. It didn't matter that old Biff shouldn't have been able to return to the same 2015 as he left from because he changed the past by giving his younger self the sports almanac, which changed the future. But hey, those are just details, man. What matters is the feeling that you get from the trilogy and the journey you go on with the characters. It seemed as if it was destiny, for Back to the Future to remain the biggest name in the realm of time travel fiction. And sure, for most people, it will. However, in recent years, there's been a particular German Netflix show which has been making waves in the genre. Waves that I feel owe some of their acclaim to the giant ship whose wake they were created from. From my first viewing of Dark, I noticed the creators, Baran bo Odar and Jontje Vries, were inspired by the classic Robert Zemeckis trilogy. So much so that I was inspired to make this video, outlining all of the ways that I feel Dark was inspired by Back to the Future. First of all, however, I will state the obvious for anyone keeping score. Back to the Future and Dark take very different approaches to the genre. One is a light and tone family jaunt through time, and the other, as the title suggests, is a dark entanglement which in the end causes us to reflect upon the meaning of our own existence. So yeah, there are differences, but oh lordy, are there similarities too. I'm going to start with my showstopper, my most convincing point that the creators of Dark were inspired by Back to the Future. So, as I was watching the first series of Dark back when it was first released, I noted the cool parallel between Season 1 and the first film of the Back to the Future trilogy. In both, the main character travels back in time to witness their parents in their teenage years. Obviously Marty McFly gets a little bit more involved in their lives than Jonas does, but the comparison is definitely there. Also, another cool thing to note about this is that the character's intentions seem to be inverted. Marty is trying to ensure that his parents get together and have him, whereas Jonas is doing all he can to ensure that he isn't born, whether he wants to believe it or not. This idea of Dark inverting something from Back to the Future will come up again later, so stay tuned. Having noticed this parallel, I was keenly on the lookout for something similar in Season 2. And what do you know? There was one. In Back to the Future Part 2, there is a sequence where Marty McFly must retrieve the sports almanac from Biff, all the while avoiding contact with his younger self from the first film. This is paralleled in Dark Season 2, Episode 6, An Endless Cycle. In this episode, Jonas is sent by Adam to stop his father killing himself. Whilst on this mission, he has to avoid contact with his younger self, and he's even mistaken for his younger self, very much like Marty McFly in Back to the Future 2. This realization that there were two major story points in Dark inspired by Back to the Future made me start to theorize about how Dark would continue this in Season 3. I felt there was no way that these similarities were an accident. Why wouldn't you be inspired by the most successful trilogy about time travel ever? Especially if you're also making a trilogy of sorts. Back to the Future's format of revealing a different time zone each film worked really well. With each film, the world, so to speak, got bigger. Dark has done a similar thing. With each season, there is more time zones and more aspects to the time travel revealed. Because of this, I thought it was a given that, like Back to the Future, Dark's third and final offering would go into the late 1800s. This isn't the end of the similarities, however. There is also a plot point in Season 3 that seems to be directly inspired by the final Back to the Future film. I am of course referring to the idea that Stranger Jonas, Magnus, Franziska, and Bartos travel to 1888 by accident due to the malfunction of the time machine during the apocalypse, and they're stuck there because they have no fuel to travel back to the future. This is perfectly analogous to Back to the Future 3, in which Doc was zapped to 1885 by an accident due to the DeLorean being struck by lightning. He's then stuck there because he has no fuel. There's no way this isn't a direct reference. So let's summarize this. Season 1 of Dark parallels Back to the Future through the main character traveling back in time to see his parents at a similar age to him. We then have Season 2 of Dark, which parallels Back to the Future Part 2, through the main character traveling through time and having to avoid a younger version of himself while he tries to stop something happening. And finally, Season 3 of Dark parallels Back to the Future Part 3 by having characters accidentally travel to the distant past where they're stuck because they have no fuel. To me, it makes sense that Dark was inspired by Back to the Future in this way. It was a great way for the series to feel familiar and grounded in the tradition of the time travel genre, which gave them the ability to take risks and break new ground. And I, for one, enjoyed the hell out of it. Let me paint a picture for you. The creators of Dark have been asked to pitch a show to Netflix. They haven't got any complete ideas, and they're struggling to come up with a pitch. All of a sudden, a brainwave hits. What if we make a show in a world like the alternate world in Back to the Future 2, but we don't reveal that it wasn't the original timeline or world until the end of the show? Maybe the show should follow the characters of this world that shouldn't exist, and we could follow them on the journey of them finding out that their world wasn't the original world. Now, obviously I'm joking here, and I give the creators of Dark way more credit than this scenario portrays. However, with that being said, I do believe, probably not likely, but it's possible that the creators came up with the idea that the world we're following in the show isn't the original world, because they were inspired by, or making a reference to, Back to the Future 2. In other words, like I said earlier, they inverted the story from Back to the Future. Think about it. Just like old Biff caused the timelines to deviate by giving himself the almanac, Origin HD Townhouse caused his world to be destroyed and an alternate world or worlds to be created. This then prompted characters to travel through time, or worlds in the case of Dark, to change the past in order to stop the deviation or destruction of the world happening. Now, again, Dark goes far beyond Back to the Future in terms of aspects to time travel, and even introduces traveling between worlds. However, for this small piece of the story, there's definitely a strong parallel to the classic 80s film. As well as the similarities in plot, there are also a lot of other smaller references in Dark to Back to the Future. This section will be a quick-fire look at some of them. What up, bros? Here for the top 10 moments from Dark that reference Back to the Future. Let's get right into it. Number 1. A lot of focus is given to family portraits. Number 2. Comics. Number 3. The Lady in the Lake story is similar to the Clara Clayton in the Ravine story. Number 4. Claudia tries to change the happenings of a newspaper article from the future. Number 5. Loads of shots of clocks. I mean, fair enough, it is time travel, so it's natural to think about using shots of clocks, but Back to the Future also did it, so I'm going to include it. Number 6. You sent me a letter. Number 7. There is an old, long, white-haired man who explains all of time travel's technicalities. Number 8. There's a book that outlines what happens in the future. Number 9. The time machine is nuclear powered. And the most blatant similarity of them all. Number 10. A time-traveling dog. And here's a few honorary mentions. It's clear that there are many allusions to Back to the Future within Dark. However, I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that they are very different and unique pieces. Bearing this in mind, in this section I'm going to discuss what I perceive to be the main difference between the two. The way time travel works. In Back to the Future, the characters are able to travel back in time and alter the past, which in turn alters the future. Whereas in Dark, it's a bit more complicated than that. So complicated, in fact, I'm sure fans of the show will be debating it in corners of the internet for years to come. So for the first 3 seasons and 7 episodes, the system of time travel put forward in Dark is the idea that all events are predetermined and you cannot change anything. For example, when Ulrich went back in time to beat Helga, he had always done this. This was always the past of the world that he lived in. Compare this with Back to the Future, where Marty's actions in the past seem to affect the future in various ways. For example, removing the grease from his father's hair. This is definitely a huge difference of approach in the 2 shows. Then all of a sudden, in the final episode of Dark, Claudia throws a spanner in our understanding to the predetermined nature of time travel within the show. She discovered that both Adam's world and Eva's world were born out of an accident that happened in a 3rd world known as the Origin World. This makes us question whether or not Claudia was predetermined to break the cycle, or was she acting with free will. Don't throw rocks at me, but I personally feel like the inclusion of the childhood visions through the doorways is the creators hinting that maybe it was supposed to happen this way. However, I could be wrong, and there doesn't seem to be a correct answer. This lack of clarity sparks debate and analysis and thought and repeat viewing. Back to the Future is a great set of films, and they are some of my favourites from my childhood. But they're trying to entertain us, and that's all. Don't get me wrong, they do a fantastic job of it, but that's what it is, entertainment. And sure, so is Dark if you boil it down. I don't want to get too pretentious here, but you know what I mean. Dark has a bit more to offer in terms of subject matter and complexity. It's like the difference between Harry Potter and A Song of Ice and Fire. One is soft, one is hard. Neither is objectively better than the other. They're just different. Also, I'm not even going to get into the timeline splits in this video, but this is also a further difference in the approach to time travel between the 2 projects. Don't get me wrong, I'm not sitting here saying that Dark has copied Back to the Future. I'm saying that it's been inspired by it and even referenced it sometimes, which is a very different thing. And I, for one, as a fan of both, really enjoyed those moments in Dark where I could draw parallels to my childhood viewing of time travel. It's also very clear to me that the creators of Dark, even though it's a German show, have tried to make it appeal and be more identifiable to an international audience. I feel like these choices to reference and be inspired by Back to the Future were a conscious choice to make a Western, English-speaking audience identify with a relatively small German TV show. And I think they were pretty successful.